Ubisoft tries to have multiple game franchises running side by side simultaneously, but there's one that stands out beyond the rest. This is the Far Cry series. The Far Cry series began all the way back in 2004 and hasn't stopped. There's been several entries into the series so far, with there being additional DLCs. Now for today, we are just going to be focusing on the main title releases, but with every single one of them, we're going to be highlighting the best thing from each. Starting off, we're going all the way back to where this all began, with Far Cry 1 in 2004. It's difficult to judge a game which is at the start of the series because it was just a new idea, and ever since then, Ubisoft has evolved in every possible way to improve upon certain gameplay mechanics which made Far Cry amazing within the very first title. Since then, Ubisoft has improved within the story, they've improved within the locations and scenery, the setting, they've improved in the conflict and combat, they've improved in every possible area, but what Far Cry did very well was bring this all together for the very first time as a proof of concept to what really could be an amazing series. If Far Cry wasn't done in the way that it was back in 2004, there's a good chance that this series would never exist. It wouldn't be as successful as what it currently is. And for that, the best thing about it makes it that it is the first Far Cry, and with everything that Ubisoft did do, even though to today's standards, they've of course improved upon it, especially with the improvement of technology, this was still the start of a brand new series which has led to Ubisoft making hundreds of millions every single year just from Far Cry itself. Far Cry 2. Far Cry 2 was released in 2008 for PC, PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. And with Far Cry 2, they really tried to make more of everything compared to what they did within Far Cry 1. But the thing that really stood out was the amazing weapon gameplay. This is something that Ubisoft did really well with Far Cry 2. Weapons had a lot of finer details, with there being features such as weapon jamming and weapon degradation. Not only that, but it felt like the weapons were balanced. They felt powerful, but not too powerful that it just felt like a breeze when going through different types of missions. In 2008, to have an open world shooter like this with very fine features which made it so much more immersive, these were the scenarios which led to some very intense battles, even more than the fights initially were, because let's be real, the fights by themselves, even if there wasn't these types of gameplay mechanics, they would already be intense, but they just added another level to this. Not only that, but because of this extra level, sometimes you really needed to overthink your strategy. Before you take on the next lot of enemies, you really need to question whether or not your current state of weapons are going to be able to handle it. Far Cry 3. Far Cry 3 was released in 2012, and when people normally talk about the series being at its peak, this was when. They took everything that was good from Far Cry 2, kept it within the game, but also built upon it, making other areas feel like there's that extra level that we were talking about. But the thing that really stood out when people talk about Far Cry 3 is the story. The story follows Jason Brody, who is on holiday and ends up skydiving with his brothers and friends whilst being on vacation, but ultimately gets captured by the warlord Voss. The expectation is that they were going to be sold for slavery, but somehow Jason manages to escape, and that's where his journey begins in order to save his friends. On the surface, it's nothing too crazy, but it's the way in which this story unravels. The characters which are used are amazing, with Voss not only being a great character within the game, but ended up being a fan favorite across the years, and even in other titles, there's games which look to Voss as inspiration from Far Cry 3. And it's no wonder whenever Michael Mando, who is the character that played Voss within Far Cry 3, whenever he has something to say about the Far Cry franchise, fans go absolutely mental. Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon. With Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon, this carried over the amazing mechanics from the original Far Cry 3 game, but did have an interesting take on things. The best part from Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon was its innovative idea. The game is set in the dystopian version of 2007. Ubisoft describes the game as an 80s VHS version of the future, where the players must get to the girl, kill the bad guys, and save the world. And it's a clever idea. It worked really well, taking everything that was good from Far Cry 3 but putting it into a completely different setting and also new scenarios. The idea was completely different to what we've seen before from any type of game, but also especially within the Far Cry series from this point, but still improved upon the main part of the game, which kept players interested, and it led to it being a success. Far Cry 4. Far Cry 4 was released in 2014 and was a game designed for the power of the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. This was the point in which games were evolving at a very fast rate, with the recent releases of Grand Theft Auto 5 and The Last of Us. Games were starting to become very impressive in all departments, from the overall size of the game to storytelling and the visuals. Far Cry 4 certainly matched the competition. It didn't quite beat the competition, but something that definitely got close was the atmosphere. Karat was a brilliant open world area with loads of different environments to explore and lots of wildlife. This just made the game feel alive and created an outstanding atmosphere. By 2014, this was crucial in order to create a successful open world and definitely led to some viral content, especially when Ubisoft released the original trailers, which just showed the open world and everything that it had to offer with its setting. This led to some great opening cutscenes with just the scenery, and that was enough to get players hooked. Far Cry Primal. Far Cry Primal was released between Far Cry 4 and Far Cry 5 and is a bit of an interesting one. At this point, Far Cry was known for it to be an open world action adventure shooter game. That's what it was through and through, but with Far Cry Primal, they took one of those elements away, which was the shooting side. The game itself is set approximately in 10,000 BC after the last Ice Age. You're not running around using a machine gun to take out enemies. Instead, you're going to be using spears. This change, of course, just like any change within a series, didn't go down too well. But despite this, Ubisoft still ended with Far Cry Primal having fairly positive reviews and gave an experience unlike anything that we've seen from a AAA game company with the setting that they selected. But one of the things that really stood out for fans, whether they liked the series or not, were the Far Cry Primal animals. There were loads of animals within the game, and a lot of them would try to attack you, but there were some called primal animals, and they were at the top of the food chain. Not only can you fight these animals, but you can also tame them, and that's really where fans enjoyed this game. You can tame a saber-toothed tiger, which will then help you when you do get into conflict with other animals as well as enemies. Far Cry 5. Far Cry 5 was released in 2018 and is really considered a modern game. Just like any other Far Cry game, it is important to keep the game's style. Not the style of Primal, but the style of what was there originally for Far Cry. But with this, it evolved in many ways to make the game more interesting and keep players coming back. A system that worked incredibly well within Far Cry 5 was the companion system. This was seen within previous games, and we did briefly just mention it within Primal, but they added a whole new level to this and has since got even better. Whereas in Far Cry Primal, you could tame different types of animals as the best thing to do, within Far Cry 5, you could hire other types of NPCs. And with this, they did expand on Primal by allowing you to recruit different types of animals and use them in order for you to take down other types of enemies as well as enemy bases. But they also allowed you to be a bit more stealthy and a bit more subtle by also bringing on NPCs that would be carrying a bow and arrow. The companions that you can choose have loads of details, and that's what really expanded on this. Your approach now isn't just about you trying to take as many enemies on as possible. It's now, do you go and use that animal over in a corner to help you take out enemies so that you don't need to do it? Or do you hire some help from another person? And each of those have different approaches. With the animal, it's probably going to create a bit of noise, but with the person, you may be able to take out a lot of the enemies without anyone even noticing. Far Cry New Dawn. Far Cry New Dawn was released just 1 year after Far Cry 5 in 2019. It took a lot of the gameplay mechanics as well as graphical styles from Far Cry 5, but that wasn't a complaint. They took everything that was good and then expanded it even further to allow players to keep on doing exactly what they wanted to do, whilst also adding a few new activities opportunities to keep players interested. It did reuse a lot of gameplay mechanics, but they reused them well, and that's the key point here. That's what made it the best. There's several times throughout not just Far Cry, but also other game series that Ubisoft have put together where they try to rush the next game. And it mainly comes down to it being stuck on a very limited budget. But what's interesting is that every single time that it's happened, even though it is on a lower budget, they still come out on top to deliver something which does get a pretty decent review. And finally, we have Far Cry 6, a recent release from Ubisoft back in 2021. Whilst Far Cry 6 isn't considered the best within the series by players, there's something it does very well and keeps up with to today's standards, and this is the amount of content that's available. The story itself is about 23 hours in length, plus on top of that there's an extra 50 hours of content in order for you to get 100% completion. It's not the longest game in the world, but it's reasonable. Ubisoft made a mistake with the Assassin's Creed series, especially with Valhalla, where it was way too long. The story itself was about 50 to 60 hours in length, and it led to it having the lowest ever retention rate out of any of the Assassin's Creeds and pretty much any of their games. So even though Far Cry 6 isn't the longest, it's actually on track for them being a much higher completion rate for the amount of content that they've added to the game, which is a very good ratio. We also can't forget this is a title, and this is something that we haven't had time to highlight because there's just been better things than it, but throughout a lot of Far Cry games there's multiple endings, and Far Cry 6 is no different. There's a true ending, a secret ending, and a rather jaw-dropping post-credits revelation. And all of this is packed into a world of Yara, which is where Far Cry 6 is set, being a lot bigger than what we've seen from any of the Far Cry titles. And it's not just by a little bit. You can easily compare the Far Cry 5's map to Far Cry 6's map, and there is an obvious and clear difference. There's going to be a lot of areas in order for you to explore. And because of how this series has evolved over the year, it's not just a case of it being a 50-hour game where you go from point A to point B. And this does kind of link into the multiple endings. There's choices. There's a choice in the way in which you approach things, which can really add to replayability. So the size of Far Cry 6 is what really makes it what it is. But we've now gone through the best thing about each Far Cry title. If you enjoyed this video, then I highly recommend clicking the next video, which is now showing on screen. With that one, we're going through the best thing about each Assassin's Creed. So if you do want to see that, that video is now on screen. Click that and I'll be over there to guide you through each Assassin's Creed.